everyone, it's Brad Thorpe. Welcome to another edition of Zero Velocity Podcast. Today we are talking about isometrics for postpartum women. Now, traditionally when you hear the word postpartum, you usually have that followed up with the word depression. That's not what we're talking about today. We're going to leave that to the psychiatrists and the psychologists. We'll leave that in their realm. I'm going to stay to my lane. Today we're talking about body function postpartum. And some of the key problems that women face are things like laxity and diastasis recti and pelvic floor issues and back pain. So we're going to kind of touch upon all of those subjects today. And then we're going to leave you some insight on how to combat and rectify the situations. So if you guys are open to that and you're open to learning, we're going to have a great time today because, hey, with the number of women out there, it's roughly 56% of the global population. So there's more women than men. So this is hugely important. And I, as a male, owe a debt of gratitude to all the women in my life because if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't have my daughter and I wouldn't be here. So it comes from the heart today. So hopefully some of this resonates with you guys because we need to make you guys feel better. It's imperative. So one of the things that we want to look at is just the stages of pregnancy to start. Here we got this beautiful woman and we're going through the different sort of stages, right? So obviously photo one all the way over to the left is basically not pregnant. All the way over to the right, we have pregnancy and child. Now, one of the interesting things that we look at is basically just how the spinal structure changes from basically a more upright posture to basically a forward slouch or a spinally extended position. So those are some things we're going to talk about. I'm going to touch upon that a little bit later when we get into muscle function. So one of the other things that we look at is with women, the number one problem pregnant women face over the course of their pregnancy is this word called laxity. And we're not talking laxatives. This is not about going to the bathroom. This is about laxity. This is about getting loose. So what happens with pregnancy is there's a higher level of elastin, which is this chemical within your body that says, hey, we need to prepare this body to sort of hold another human. We need to alter hip position. We need to make the joint structure loose. Remember that word, loose. So loose and laxity are almost interchangeable, right? Your body gets loose in order to accommodate the body weight gain, just because you need the calories and the protective environment to grow this child. So we're going to jump to one of the biggest complaints that I hear with women. Diastasis recti. What is it? Well, first of all, it's a separation of this thing called your linea alba. That's that thing down the center. You see that on the photo there? You have all these little sort of compartments. That's your rectus abdominis. Now that linea alba, so that's a very, very tight fibrous tissue that basically when gets stretched, tears. And that's what diastasis recti is. It's a tearing of the linea alba. Now this gets really problematic later in life if you've had that sort of torn tissue in that abdominal wall. Now, optically, some people don't like it because it doesn't look like your stomach is held together properly. You'll often get sort of adipose tissue or fat cells that permeate into that area in order to fill up the area. Now, if you get sort of like tight abs and stuff, you'll see almost like a pocket in and around the umbilicus, which is your belly button, that doesn't really hold firm as well anymore. Now, one of the things that we can look to do is discuss some of the other muscles that aren't named rectus abdominis, which are going to help tighten and cinch up that abdominal wall. We're going to look at that a little bit later when we look at some exercises to help address this situation. Now, one of the other things that we also have to talk about is pelvic floor. Pelvic floor is a highly complex muscular region. I mean, we got the perineals, we got all of these other muscles. You can read them. Now, one of the things that we always talk about when we look at muscles, this guy named Kegel. So he was a gynecologist who basically invented isometrics to help with incontinence. And whether it's postpartum or just aging. Everyone on the planet says, hey, to train your pelvic floor muscles, we got to do Kegels. Now, what most people don't understand, Kegels are isometric muscle contractions. So you guys have understood the benefits of isometrics without actually knowing it. Because oftentimes, the hugely beneficial exercises people tell people to do are isometric based. But they change the name to make it a little bit more personal, a little bit more accessible and sexy, right? In this case, they just stole the guy's last name and said, hey, I'm just going to name it after the guy who really kind of pushed this forward. Now, one of the things that you look at this, so Kegel exercises is non-surgical treatments of urinary incontinence from perineal muscle weakness and or laxity. Remember I mentioned that word earlier, laxity. So if Kegels helps with laxity, do you think it could help with some other stuff? So here's one of the apparatuses we recommend for Kegel exercises, right? You can sort of see the shape and the structure. The problem with the shape and structure is based off the vaginal wall and opening. When you have that bulbous sort of feature, it's going to tighten around there in certain instances. Now, one thing that you may actually look to use instead of these sort of bend wall looking balls is more of a sort of a vibrator or a dildo, to be honest, right? Because that's going to provide a little bit more thickness, gives you better contact surface to create that contraction, right? Because when you have that circular or that sort of indent, depending on the size of the vaginal opening, what can happen is, well, if you still have that tension, you can get around it. So you don't actually have to work as hard, right? And our goal with providing resistance to muscles is to have something that's going to create better levels of tension. Now, interestingly, if we also look at some of the other things that women face, back pain, right? Because when you start to stretch the abdominal wall, when you tear that linea alba, when you have a cesarean section, whether it's transverse, which cuts across the torso, or the classical cesarean section, which actually cuts down through the linea alba, further traumatizing that tissue, right? With the sort of transverse, they do it off to the side a little bit so they can keep that transverse abdominis intact. Not transverse abdominis, linea alba, sorry. But some of the things that we have to think about if we're looking at reestablishing neurological connection to this structure. Think in terms of you want to do that Kegel, or phrased properly, we want you to do an isometric contraction for your abdominal wall. Now, it's not just as simple as that, because there's multiple regions to your abdominal wall, and there's multiple different muscles. And when you start to explore it, you look at the deepest layer of your abdominal wall, and that actually sits on your spine, right? And we've discussed this in previous exercises. It's called your psoas muscle. It basically comes up, you have what's called a diaphragmatic division, which comes from basically the top portion of your lumbar spine, and it goes to the diaphragm and the central tendon of what's called the xiphoid process, which is this thing kind of right here. Right now, with pregnancy, you guys probably got acid reflux and stuff. So things that we have to think about are all the tissues within that region. So if we're thinking about the tissues, and we have this muscle called your psoas, it is the deepest layer of your abdominal wall, right? Most people will call it a spinal muscle, right? I find that really confusing for a lot of people, just because what it does, it causes better levels of compression on the anterior surface of your spine. It actually connects your spine to your femur. That's your leg bone. Now, what happens is when you cause better levels of compression there, it pulls that spine forward, right? So you guys see that, like when with pregnancy, you get extended, and what happens is with that psoas muscle, it kind of gets stretched for about 9 months, right? Well, it's actually about 6 months, depending on the term of the pregnancy. So what happens is you go through that like, oh, my back kind of hurts, because what's happening is you're getting front loaded, right? So that pregnancy, as it sort of your belly distends, you're forcing the spinal extension to sort of keep your body upright. It's just literally playing with physics. Now, what happens is those muscles become a little bit stretched, so they stop doing their job. So what will happen is those muscles become lax, or loose, as we discussed. Now, what will happen in that back pain scenario, well, it gets super agitating and it kind of sucks, right? You tend to want to loosen it off further. You want to sort of say, let's make these muscles loose so I don't feel that pain. So you foam roll, you massage, you use these Theraguns to sort of annihilate that tension within the muscle structure. Now the problem with that is now you've made the muscles in the front loose because they're not working properly, and now you've made the muscles in the back loose due to therapeutic or manual intervention. Now it provides a temporary relief, and so for that it's great. Long term, doesn't provide much relief, to be honest. And you guys know what I'm talking about because the next morning you wake up and go, oh, it's still here. Now, one thing that we gotta really focus on is this word stop. Stop stretching. Remember looseness and laxity? Why do you stretch? It's really kind of counterproductive to what we want to do, which is create strength and stability. Now, when we create strength and stability, remember, you also have this high level of elastin that is being dumped into your body to basically make your joints loose. So exercise becomes a little bit more hazardous into your pregnancy as well as post-pregnancy or postpartum. Now, how do you start to exercise? How do you re-engage postpartum? You've gone through the pregnancy, you're tired, you're exhausted all the time, your nutrition might not necessarily be sound. 800 calories of your nutrition goes to the production of milk for your baby. So you're going to be chronically undernourished. So we have to look at this exercise component. And I'm going to tie this all in to one thing. Doing isometric exercise will help with diastasis recti, it will help with your pelvic floor, and it will help with your back pain. But here's one of the cool features of isometrics. It's safer, so it avoids injury, right? It's going to reduce your risk of injury when you reintroduce exercise back into your life. Cardio-based training is what they traditionally promote to sort of say, hey, let's lose that weight, right? The problem is post-pregnancy, you have all this elastin within your structure. It doesn't instantly go away. So you have all this laxity, and what they're telling you now is to gyrate on a totally unstable body through space to get healthier. Now, if you're like many people and you start exercising, it's not comfortable reintroducing exercise because you do have this laxity. Plus, you also have this high level of fatigue. So I'm going to now show you a couple different exercises that you can do at home to help stabilize both your pelvic floor, increase that strength and stability through your rectus abdominis and your abdominal muscles, right? And just to quickly go over those. So you have your psoas as the deepest layer, right? That's traditionally a spinal muscle. Then you have what's called your transverse abdominis. That's going to be the deepest muscle, and that's the one that cinches in. It's like almost like a tire going around your midsection. Then the next layer would be what's called your internal obliques. They're traditionally the ones on the side. They kind of look like a horse saddle, to be honest, right? So if I sort of back up here, and what they do is they kind of like look like this, and they sort of pull back. And then you have your external obliques that kind of come down here. And then you have your rectus abdominis. Those are the ones on the front, right? Those are the six-pack looking muscles. And then you have this muscle that nobody ever talks about. It's called your pyramidalis. It is just below your umbilicus, so just below your belly button, and it's kind of like a triangular shaped muscle. It's on both left and right side. So if here is my umbilicus, it basically goes from here down to my pubic bone. So it's a triangle shaped muscle. How do I make a triangle here? Okay, so if I'm really bad at looking at this camera making a triangle. So it goes down like that. Now what it does, it anchors and pulls down that linea alba. So if you can create tension to this muscle and increase the strength, it is going to, if we pull up that linea alba picture again, what happens is you see how it's got that separation of that pulling apart of that tissue. Now what happens is when you tighten it, when you pull it down harder, right, with that pyramidalis muscle, so if we cinch that down, it's kind of like if I pull down on my shirt, right, it's going to pull together into the center. So the pyramidalis muscle is imperative for narrowing or cinching in on that linea alba. Now the interesting thing is, if we look at the posterior side, so if we look at our pelvic structure, so as it goes around, what the linea alba does, or the pyramidalis actually, it pulls the pubic bone sort of forward and up. So it's actually going to take a little bit of pressure also off your SI joint, right? That's the sacroiliac joint. That's the part on the back side, that triangular shaped wedge, you know, that part that you always go like, oh, that just hurts, right? Because when I sort of bring my pelvis forward and let this fall out, let's see if I can distend my belly, right? And now what's going to happen is that's going to cinch down, and I'm going to start to walk like this. And I'm not walking like this to mock anybody, but the reality of the situation is when we're looking at pregnancy, we start to waddle as we get, and that's just how do we actually function through space. Like, we don't have the ability to swing our leg forward. We actually got to shift, and then shift, and then shift. So we're going to show you 3 different exercises today. One is going to target your glute medius, because that's going to stabilize your pelvis, right? That's really important when doing abdominal exercises. Don't just start with your abs. We're going to start by stabilizing your pelvis first, then we're going to do some abdominal stuff. Because otherwise it's kind of like trying to play tug of war with nobody holding on. So I hope that makes sense to you. Because if there's instability and you're not properly anchored with your pelvis, your abs, they don't really have a hope in, you know, HE double hockey sticks in order to sort of function better. So what we're going to do, now, obviously the Isophit MSK is a great option. But once you're looking at pregnancy, you're also looking at, like, how do I actually do this stuff at home? Cost and money is important. So we have a big, huge, fancy exercise product here. It's called a wall, right? It's actually the foundation of the Isophit, right? I needed a huge, fancy wall to do a whole bunch of isometrics. That's why I created it. So what I want you guys to do, right? Balance might be an issue because you guys are unstable because you have this laxity. So with your arm, support the structure here. And what you want to do is just bring that leg straight out to the side. And you want to sort of think in terms of don't try too hard because you're relatively new to this exercise. And the reason we want you to do it standing up is because we want you to learn how to tighten your abdominals while engaging your hip muscle. Now, be very mindful not to bring that leg forward, right? Because that's going to work now a little bit more on the backside and a little bit more of the front hip. It's not going to work that sort of glute medius. And then if you bring it too far back, that changes stuff as well. Not to say they're wrong, just start with doing something simple. Right? Same thing on the other side. And what I want you guys to do is when you're new, just start with 3 sets, 30 seconds at sub-maximal intent, right? So don't try that hard. Try with like 40% effort. Don't try to like maximize and go, oh, I got to try this at 100% because I want to get a better result. What happens when you try at 100%? You do too much. You miss the target. Our goal is to have you get that 100 or that 40%. Now, next thing is I want you to lie down on the ground. You're going to bring your hip and knee to tabletop position, and then you're going to rotate your torso. So it's like you're trying to lift your bum up off the ground. And you're just going to press that knee into that wall. Shoulders stay down. Now your foot, you want to try to get your foot flat against the wall, and you're driving your knee across. So what that's going to work is all of the muscles in through the left hip, the muscles that are going to help rotate your spine, the upper spine to the right, the lower spine to the left. The involved leg here, keep it nice and tight. And then we're going to try to do that on the other side as well. So quick transition, all you have to do is spin around. So hip and knee to 90 degrees, bring that across all the way through. And if you guys are listening to us on Spotify, make sure for these exercises, you go check us out on YouTube. So that way you can kind of see it. So tighten right through there. And the last one we're going to show you. Now, it's pretty simple in the sense that I just want you to sit up nice and tall. And I want you to rotate as far as you can, either to the left or the right. And then what you're going to do is try to crunch forward. Now, the problem here, just doing this, is you don't have a restraint. So if you got like an exercise ball that you can put between your shoulder and your knee, you have your husband or your partner come over and just brace your shoulder so you're pulling into a resistance source. Or this is once again where that Isophit MSK really comes in to play, because it does provide a true level of resistance for a lot of exercises. And I'll just sort of angle my body here, and you can sort of pull into that. So that way what you can do is start targeting your core musculature. And that gets into a muscle called your Pyramidalis muscle, which is the one we talked about. So working those three different muscles, or three different exercises. First, the exercise for that glute medius, that standing one, is going to stabilize our pelvis. The second one was for those deeper abdominal muscles. It gets into your psoas because you got that hip flex component, and your transverse also gets into the internal external obliques as well. And then that third exercise that we went over was basically for that lower portion of the abdominal wall, as well as that pyramidalis. So anyways, if you guys have any questions, email me. I'm more than happy to help you guys work through some of the problems that you guys might be facing out there. And once again, thank you guys very much for joining us today on Zero Velocity Podcast, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Talk soon. Just like to thank my sponsors, Kinvent, Zenkai Sports, and of course, Isophit. Perfect.